There is a question that many of us have heard, maybe even just this morning, and that's, where are you from? It's a simple question, unless you've lived in 7 countries, have parents from 2 more, and still aren't sure what home really means. For a long time, I didn't really know how to answer it, and I would always think, do they want the short version or the truth? Because the short version is that I was born in Israel. But the truth, it's my Romanian grandmother's kitchen, it's a jungle classroom in Thailand, it's a lecture hall in Vienna, it's a tapas bar in Spain. For a long time, I thought the problem was that I didn't really belong anywhere. But over time, I realized that maybe the reason I don't belong anywhere is because, in a way, I belong everywhere. Growing up between all these different worlds taught me something that I didn't really have words for back then. Every time I moved, I had to learn a new language, not just spoken words, but context, how to greet a teacher, when silence means respect, what it means to disagree, even what sounds you should make when you eat. Those invisible rules, the ones that shape how we see, speak, and connect, became fascinating to me. And I realized that meaning doesn't just live in what we say, it lives around it. It lives in the space between stories. Even before I ever left Israel with my family, I was already living between worlds. My mom's family is Romanian. Some of them are here today. You could show up at my grandmother's apartment with 5 minutes notice and she'd still find a way to open the door with a smile and feed you like you hadn't eaten in a week. There were fewer rules, more noise, more people talking over each other, whether on the phone or in person. My dad's parents, on the other hand, are Dutch. Visiting them meant scheduling ahead, literally getting into their diaries, and it would drive my mom crazy quite a lot. She would say, we're family, why do we need an appointment? But it wasn't less caring, it was just a different way of showing it. One more spontaneous, one more structured. That was my first lesson in cultural contrast, how 2 forms of love can look so different yet still both be true. Then came my move to Europe when I was 18. But before all of that, there was so much more that happened between those years. When I was 12, we moved to Thailand, and that was the first kind of big shock that I had in my way around the world. I didn't speak Thai or English. The first few weeks in school I spent in classrooms without understanding a single word, but I felt oddly at ease. My siblings struggled to adjust a lot more, but I really loved being surrounded by so many languages, accents, and ways of seeing the world. It was noisy and confusing, but it felt alive, like you were constantly discovering new versions of the same song. Then after that, we moved to China, and that deepened that even further. My classmates and teachers came from everywhere. I learned about apartheid and hyperinflation from my Zimbabwean history teacher and took that into an economics project with my American one. My English teachers alone came from the US, Canada, New Zealand, and the UK, each with a different accent, different sense of humor, different way of thinking. So every subject and each new culture revealed yet another lens through which people connected. And I learned that belonging isn't just about fitting in, it's about tuning in. I didn't really realize it back then, but what I was learning in those international school environments was to think multidimensionally, to hold more than one truth at once. And looking back, that's probably what drew me to the world of TED later in life, that same intersection of perspectives, the belief that ideas become richer when they meet. And then when I was 18, I left home and I moved to Europe. And that was strangely my biggest culture shock, not because I was surrounded by difference, but because I wasn't all of a sudden. Everyone spoke my language, they looked like me, they followed familiar norms, and yet I still felt less at home than I did back in Thailand or China. So I found myself drawn back into multicultural spaces, spaces where accents blended and stories overlapped, similar to where we are today. Those were the spaces that really felt like home. Growing up between all those different worlds showed me that meaning doesn't just come from what's said, it comes from everything around it. It comes from the space in between stories. Home to me isn't a single point on a map. It's not a dot that you can just point to. It's what makes our stories feel like they belong. And maybe that's why the meaning of home can change, because we do as well. People everywhere have the same needs: understanding, belonging, identity, but the way we communicate those needs differs depending on the frame that we're standing in. This is what I call the invisible context that's shaping it. And I learned that in a very literal way when I was living here in Vienna. I came here to do my master's, and for my master's dissertation, I compared conflict resolution approaches between Europe and China, and the results couldn't really have been more different. In Europe, conflict is something to be resolved through clarity and directness. You put everything out on the table, you talk it out, you reach an agreement. In China, the goal isn't to win any sort of argument, it's simply to preserve harmony. So avoiding open conflict isn't weakness, it's wisdom. And both approaches work, but only within their own frame. I moved to Spain 3 years ago. And one of the things that kind of brought me back to the way I grew up was their culture around eating. In Asia, where I grew up, eating is one of the most social things you can do. You sit around, you share dishes, you linger, you talk. In Central Europe, in places like the Czech Republic, where I spent 10 years of my life, and here in Austria, eating is a little more structured. You sit down, you eat, and then you move on. When I moved to Spain 3 years ago, I still remember that first long dinner, 3 hours in, still talking, still ordering more food. And there was a deep sense of familiarity that came with that. And that was because it took me back to the way that I grew up. That's the power of context. It's invisible, but it changes everything: how we speak, how we eat, how we resolve conflict, even how we share, even how we show love. And that's still something that I work with today when I coach public speakers. That's often the missing piece: not their words, not their slides, but their frame, the context. And because when you can see that frame, you can shift it. And when you can shift it, you invite people in and create that connection that then leads to influence. 3 years ago, I went to a gallery opening in Marbella in Spain, where I live, and I stopped at this piece that I couldn't take my eyes off. Anyone recognize the artist? Banksy, one of my favorites. And this is his flower thrower, one of my favorites of his work. But this time it wasn't painted on a wall. It was mounted inside these massive, ornate gold frames, the kinds you'd expect to see around a priceless classical painting. And I must have stared at it too long that eventually the gallery owner actually walked up to me. So I asked him why they had chosen to display it in this way. And he said it was a satire, a commentary on how expensive and exclusive and inaccessible art can get, very similar to when that Banksy piece shredded itself at an auction a few years ago. I believe it was in Paris, after selling for millions. The commentary was quite similar to that. And that's when it really hit me. The frame in this case wasn't just decoration. The frame was the message. It completely shifted how the piece felt, from raw and rebellious to refined and ironic. Now, if you contrast that with the original mural painted on a wall in the West Bank, there it's not refined at all. It's urgent, political, real, defiant. Two very different frames for the same artwork and two completely different meanings. Communication works in the same way. The stories might stay the same, but the frame that you choose to put around it completely shifts how people understand it. And real communication lives in that space between what we mean and what others perceive. And it's only when you step into that space, when you understand the invisible frame around your message, that you truly start to reach people and truly start to foster a sense of understanding. So much of what causes conflict today in conversations, in politics, in culture, in my opinion, comes from a very binary understanding we have of the world. Our tendency to try and see things as right versus wrong, us versus them, black versus white, but life doesn't really work that way. There's so much more color in between, and that's what we're often too scared to explore. Because in that in-between space, things get messy, they require listening, they require curiosity, they require a willingness to be uncomfortable long enough to understand someone else's frame. And the humility to say, maybe both can be true. But it's when we start paying attention to these differences, to these in-between spaces, where we really start to understand people. It's where progress becomes possible. It's where connection really thrives, because that's where empathy lives, and that is the first point to understanding anyone. So, the question, where are you from? It's a simple question, one that I've heard all my life, and one that I've always struggled to answer because I never knew which story to choose. But over time, I realized that who I am isn't defined by passports or borders. It's shaped by everything that's come in between, the places, the moments, the people that have colored my story. Each of us in this room carries those in-between spaces, between cultures, between ideas, between generations, and it's only when we start paying attention to them, when we stop just asking where someone's from and start wondering what shaped them, where real understanding begins. In July of this year, a few weeks after my birthday and a few weeks before what would have been hers, I lost my grandmother, my last living grandparent. When I think about her, I think of the smell of soup that somehow never ran out, the stories she told, the sound of flipping through photo albums, the loud kisses, the strong hugs, everything that made her house feel alive. She was home before I knew what that word meant. So maybe belonging isn't about choosing just one place. Maybe it's about not choosing at all. Maybe it's about carrying those people and places with us wherever we go. Trevor Noah once said that we all have roots, and I'm working to build a tree strong enough for all of my branches. I think of her as one of mine, one of the strongest and most beautiful ones, actually. So the next time someone asks, where are you from? Maybe the better answer is, I'm from everywhere I've been, and from everyone who's helped me see the world in color. Because in the end, that's where connection lives, not in the edges of our stories, but in the space between them. Thank you.